to Europeans through the slave trade that more and more, I mean, the slave trade was a business, but as the business was going, right, there was a justification that was introduced that utilized the religious tradition as a means of arguing that God has intended for Africans to be slaves. And whatever the rationale, this was linked to Ham. This was called the Hamitic, or it has been called in contemporary jargon, the Hamitic hypothesis. This Hamitic hypothesis, as I mentioned earlier, was spread through the church. It was used by the church to justify enslaving blacks. It was believed to be a divine, sort of like divinely ordained. Now, I'm going to skip sources. I'm going to tell you what they say. Source number 15 is a source from a 17th century Amsterdam, written by Spinoza's Rabbi, who describes the corruption of wealthy Spanish Jews who have clearly slaves running before their chariots. He's arguing against wealth and how wealth has dealt a blow to the spiritual quality of Jewish life among the Sephardic elite in Amsterdam. The rabbi's name was Saul Mortera. I want you to hear these names just to know how this conversation persisted in Jewish life. It reaches to Rabbi Kook, the first chief rabbi, who actually writes a type of modern rationale, justification. He cannot condemn slavery because it's biblical. So he distinguishes between the way Jews treat their workers, their slaves, and the way slavers are dealt with cruelly in the market, and how edifying is the Jewish mode of slavery. That's always the back argument. It may have worked 1,000 years ago, but given what we know about slavery, it doesn't seem to me that there's a way of redeeming this. Not that doesn't seem to me. It's impossible to redeem the institution. We know what it does. It brutalizes the master, and it brutalizes a slave. It brutalizes a society, and it corrupts. And we fought a war in this country, a valiant war, to try to eradicate that slavery. Now, what I mentioned earlier is that Jews, wealthy Jews, and largely Sephardic Jews, became involved in the slave trade. They came late to the slave trade, and they were not major. So David Bryan Davis, who was a professor at Yale and who was the preeminent scholar of slavery, and who, by the way, converted to Judaism. I mean, he had a stake in this discussion in the sense that he took it very seriously, right? So he wrote. There are two articles of his that I think are open for you in the public. They both appeared in the New York Review of Books. One in 1994, I think, and the other one in one in 2000, in 94 and 2006, something like that. So in the 94 article, he talks about Jews and the slave trade. And he tells us the following. Just listen to this. In Suriname, there was a Jewish community of Dutch Jews, obviously. Jews established their own self-governing town in Suriname called Jordan Savan, Jewish Savannah, in the interior jungle. There in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the Sephardim lived the life of sugar planters, extracting labor from the African slaves in one of the most deadly and oppressive environments in the New World. One case. I should stress, he says, that even with regard to the Dutch Sephardi sugar trade, we're dealing with a few hundred families. By the 1670s, the Dutch sugar boom had ended, and Britain would soon emerge as the world's greatest sugar importer and slave trading nation. He goes on. To keep matters in perspective, we should note that in the American South in 1830, there were only 120 Jews among the 45,000 slaveholders, owning 20 or more slaves, and only 20 Jews among the 12,000 slaveholders, owning 50 or more slaves. All right? Even in Charleston, South Carolina, the percentage of free African Americans, so he goes on to talk about the numbers of Jews who own slaves compared to the rest of the population, but then he says something that we need to be aware of as well. Even in Charleston, the percentage of free African Americans who owned slaves increased from 1/2 to 3/4 as one moved up the socioeconomic scale, as indicated by the ownership of real estate. So there were black slave owners. So that's what's kind of universal in the South. although obviously you can't implicate blacks or Jews, given the numbers were minuscule compared to the rest of the trade. Then he goes on to say the following, and I want to read these two paragraphs to conclude this section. No one should defend the small number of Jews who bought and sold slaves, or who forced slaves to cut cane on the estates of Yod and Savan. No one should defend the infinitely larger number of Catholics and Protestants who built the Atlantic slave system, or defend the Muslims who initiated the process of shipping black African slaves to distant markets, or defend the Africans who captured and enslaved perhaps 20 million other Africans in order to sell them to European traders for valuable and empowering goods. But while posterity has the right and even duty to judge the past, we must emphatically renounce the dangerous, though often seductive belief in a collective guilt that descends through time to every present and future generation. While insisting that no group is responsible for the sins of its ancestors, I find it deeply disturbing that many Jews, including those who established the first synagogue in Curacao, found the path to their own liberation and affluence by participating in a system of commerce that subjected another people to contempt, dishonor, coerced labor, and degradation. It has even been said that the more enlightened rulers of 18th century Europe were much swayed by the early achievements of enfranchised Jews in Dutch Brazil, the Caribbean, and North America. This is one side or aspect of the dismal truth that our new world conceived as a land of limitless opportunity, breaking the crust of old restraints, traditions, and prejudices, was made possible only by the near extinction of indigenous populations and by the dehumanizing subjugation of the so-called African race. And we Jews had a role in that. In fact, you have printed on pages 8, 9, 10, and 11, source number 17 and source number 18, right? Two sermons. One sermon but delivered by Morris Rayfield. Morris Rayfield was the rabbi, no less, of B'nai Jeshurun, BJ, that we all know of. He himself personally opposed slavery, but he argued vociferously for a defense of the institution of slavery as a biblically sanctioned, and wrote a treatise on biblical slavery to that extent. And he argues against the preacher whom we know, Henry Ward Beecher, who had preached against him, basically ridiculing him and saying, how could a Jew sanction slavery? A Jew who had been oppressed, a Jew who carries God's word. I suggest, that you read through to understand that this argument was pervaded the Union and the southern states, and the Jewish community itself was split. And there were Jews who fought on behalf of the Confederacy. Okay. Now, what Rayfield basically says is, again, like Rav Kook, that to a Gentile, a slave is a thing, a piece of property to do whatever they wanted with. To a Jew, the slave has rights. So slavery, again, is an ennobling notion in the biblical tradition. Einhorn, the rabbi in Baltimore, who was actually endangered by his sermon and his abolitionism, mocked Rayfield for his sanctimoniousness in defending the biblical text and not promoting what he considered to be essential Jewish values. Right? He said, "We are a people who was liberated from bondage. How could we argue for the sanctioning of slavery?" Which leads me to the next section. All right, so let's skip this passage in the Midrash. There was a passage in last week's Torah portion, so you'll read about it. Moses married a Cushite woman, so it says, right? Who was she, and so on. That's for another time. This is very important. I think this is critical. Yes, the Bible presents the institution of slavery. However, I would contend the presentation of the institution of slavery in the Bible is presented in such a way that it's systematically eroded. Now, you can say that the principle is articulated right at the very beginning as Israel leaves Egypt at Sinai. The first commandment, Anochi, I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt, the house of bondage. So I've said this before. Rabbi Soloveitchik taught us that there's no narrative, no statement in the Bible that doesn't have normative value. What's the normative value that's going to be deduced from I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt, the house of bondage? So I argue as follows. It could have said I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. We knew that Egypt was a house of slavery. However, it adds the house of bondage to teach us one thing, to teach us that God was the God who redeemed the slaves. Because since we know the notion, the philosophic notion, the theological notion of imitatio Dei, that we are obligated to emulate God in our behavior, God's benevolent character we have to emulate in our behavior. So since God is the redeemer of slaves, we too must be the redeemer of slaves. I contend that's principle number one of being Jewish, that we were given the task in the world to bring an end to slavery, to undermine empires who oppress and enslave entire populations of people. So we as small people have a mission, an endless task to try to project this principle that all humans have to be given this chance to realize the image of God that with which they were created. So there's a type of religious enterprise in this. Now there's one rule after another that diminishes slavery as an institution, that and they don't exist in any other code in the ancient Near East. That is, if you knock out a slave's tooth, he goes free. If you knock out an eye, he goes free. If a slave escapes, so you'll see. I list all these verses. Look at source number 24. Source number 24, Deuteronomy 23. Thou shalt not deliver unto his master a bondman that has escaped from his master unto thee. The last time I looked, this was what the Civil War was fought over, right? Runaway slaves. So if there's a runaway slave, you cannot deliver him back to his master. He shall dwell with thee. The Hebrew, I'll read the Hebrew. Imcha yeshev, number 1. Bikir becha, number 2. Bamakom sheyachar, number 3. Biachad she'arecha, number 4. Batovlo, so he shall dwell with thee in your midst, in the place that he chooses, in one of your gates, in the place that he likes best. So the emphasis is you have to give him every opportunity to lead a productive life as part of your civilization, and that he has to be given the means by which to get a new start in life. This is, I can't emphasize enough, revolutionary in the way in which it understands slavery. The rationale here, the psychology, is that offered by Maimonides. God is a good educator. God understands that slavery is entrenched as an institution in antiquity. You can't take a people and say no slavery when that's all that they've experienced. What you can do is you can allow them to have slaves and then whittle away at the institution so that by the end, the slave has more rights than you do. All right, including, by the way, to me, it seems to me the great liberating teaching is on an unnumbered page, actually. I call it 16. If you see page 17, it's the page before that. It's the Sabbath law in Deuteronomy. The Sabbath law in Deuteronomy is critical because it quotes Exodus, the Sabbath law from the Ten Commandments in Exodus, repeated in Deuteronomy, except that the rationale is different. In Exodus, the rationale for Sabbath is God created in 6 days and rested on the seventh, so too shall you. In Deuteronomy, the rationale is that you were slaves and God redeemed you from Egypt, so the Sabbath is an equalizer in the sense a day of rest for all. And indeed, the equality is emphasized in an additional phrase in the text. Leman yanuach avdecha ba'amatcha, once again, kamocha, so that thy manservant and thy maidservant may rest as well as you. This is, again, a revolution. On Shabbos, wherever there were slaves, if there were, they became like free people. You know that once a slave was like a free person, he can't return to becoming a slave again. It doesn't happen. There's already a change in the nature of understanding. The Romans understood this. The Romans saw the Jews as ruining the economy. They criticized the Jews for these regulations, for the way in which they were weak in their treatment of slaves. Basically, they were weak because they were undoing slavery, and maybe the Romans understood that. All right. So my case is, there's a lot more to be said, but I only a few minutes, and I do want to conclude close to on time. And I did say that we would talk about reparations. where does the notion, let's just summarize what we have so far. We have so far an argument about Adam. We see that the grand tradition, the rational tradition, understands Adam to be inclusive, expansive, that Gentiles are only excluded for legal reasons from the rituals pertaining to Jews. Everyone needs to emphasize the image of God. We did see, however, that what emerges from this grand tradition is this notion of the Hamites or the Canaanites, but the Hamites being cursed, with color, being cursed with certain characteristics, physical characteristics that happen to apply to African blacks. And indeed, we see that our tradition, that's what I want us to know, our tradition is utilized, has been utilized for centuries and continues to be utilized as a justification, a biblical divine justification for slavery. That needs to be renounced, right? There's a general teaching that I present. I learned this from Christopher Stendhal, who was the dean of the Harvard Divinity School. And he taught this when he confronted a passage in the New Testament that he was teaching his students that he knew would be read in church that was anti-Jewish. He said, number one, contextualize. It pertains to Jews in the first century. Number two, interpret. What was number two? Wait, no. First was contextualize. Right. Then was reinterpret, if at all possible. And then Stendhal said, if it's impossible to reinterpret, then you have to condemn. So that's what I believe. When we were talking together, he didn't tell me you have to do the same. He was a gentleman, but I understood that every religious tradition has an obligation to renounce and denounce its teachings of contempt towards others, and understand that the Torah, as Rabbi Ishmael taught us, the Torah speaks in the language of human beings, and it's not a condemnation of God. All right, if one has a sort of a concern for how do we have the arrogance to do so. The Torah speaks in human language, and therefore the morality needs to be refined. The natural morality that we develop over time needs to be a refining ingredient against those crude elements that come down to us through the centuries. Now, and what happens to be an ennobling teaching is the teaching of reparation. And that has to do with when we escaped from Egypt. So God says, make sure to ask the Egyptians, it's on page 17, source number 29. Make sure to ask of the Egyptians to lend us their silver and all sorts of other implements. Now, there's a long Talmudic passage here about this, saying that the Egyptians came before Alexander and claimed the Jews stole our property, right? So the rabbi and demanded an answer. So a simple member of the community came forward to the rabbi and said, let me argue against them. If I lose the argument, so it's only me, I'm not significant, it's not the rabbis. So he goes ahead and he says, look, we worked for X number of years in Egypt. We were never paid a salary. So when we left Egypt, so this was our payment. Alexander liked the answer and turned to the Egyptians and said, you have 3 days to come back with an answer, and the Egyptians failed to come back with an answer. I mean, there's a lot more in the story. So I just want to say something when we have discussion of reparations for African Americans. So Ta-Nehisi Coates writes in his famous essay the following. He says, remember, and all of us need to remember this, there were 250 years of slavery in America, 90 years of Jim Crow, 60 years of separate but equal, and 35 years of racist housing policy. And our debts have been compounded over those years. It seems to me that the argument offered in the Talmud is the same argument that he offers, basically, for the need for us to consider reparations. Now, what the Torah does with this teaching is phenomenal. If you look at sources number 31 and 32. Rabbi Bachya, along with other medieval commentaries, relates the story of our escape from Egypt with goods that we consider to be back pay for our slavery, right, as the rationale that underlies the norm that appears in Deuteronomy, that which is different from the way slavery is presented in Exodus. In Deuteronomy, it says that if your brother, a Hebrew man or slave, etc., is sold to you, in the 7th year, send him free, Surah 31. And when you send him free, do not send him empty. Provide for him liberally, from your flock and from your threshing floor, from your wine. Give him a start. Pay him so that he can become a productive member of society. Don't let him revert back to his poverty so that he'll be once again sold as a slave. There's compensation to slaves. Compensation appears as a rationale. The norm is connected here to the narrative about Israel escaping Egypt. You see the translation below. It's the way in which Jewish law considers moral principles. It's formulated in a legal manner that actually concretizes what's an abstract notion and allows us to understand our sense of responsibility to those people who are less fortunate, who have been subjugated by society. Having said that, I'm sorry again that we had that break in our learning. So I'll conclude. I conclude with a vision. First of all, Isaiah's vision, as interpreted in a midrash, a medieval midrash that's found in the Geniza. Just listen to this. I mean, it's phenomenal. Source number 34. It's based on the verse of the prior verse from Isaiah 66. Isaiah said, in the Messianic period, he who is light-skinned, Germani, will take hold of the hand of him who is dark-skinned, Cushi. And the dark-skinned will take hold of the hand of the light-skinned, and arm in arm they will walk together. Maimonides teaches us at the end of his law code. At that time, that is in the Messianic times, there will be no famines and no wars, no envy and no competition. Why will there be no envy and competition? Why will there be no famines and no wars? Because there will be no scarcity, and people will know what is enough. That's the principle here, sufficiency. We need to be able to teach the lessons. It seems to me a great moral teaching that's lacking in our culture, where we have so much affluence. Sufficiency, so that there will be no scarcity and obligation to share. Now, this is a messianic vision, so let me tell you something. It seems to me that if it's good for the Messiah, it's good for us to be pursuing this. How many of us understand that to bring the Mashiach, we have to end hunger? How many of us see this as a religious obligation, that in order to bring the Messiah, we have to provide good education to all, so that people will be able to sustain their lives? Do we know that? Do we understand things narrowly, religiously, or expansively in terms of transformative ideas? This is a moment of transformation in American history. We need to take our place on this stage, participating in the change that we know from our own experience is liberating. It will liberate all of America. That was Martin Luther King's vision. We have to take there's certain concrete steps that we need to take, not to tolerate any prejudicial speak amongst us. I don't want, I'm sorry for sounding crude, but I don't think there should be any Jewish conversation allowed where the word Schwarze is allowed to be pronounced. That's simple. But we need to go beyond that in terms of understanding what needs to be done in society. People are reaching out beyond boundaries today, right? This is redeeming America as our country. If you're still on the call and you'd like to join in, there's a Kaddish for Black Lives at the end of our booklets that I'm going to recite. And please, if you can recite this with me. Maybe Giselle can unmute everybody. Creator of life, source of compassion, your breath
remains the source of our spirit.
Many of us
Cry out that we cannot breathe.
Lovingly created in your image,
created in your image,
power
all of our bodies
has imperiled our lives.
Lives
Are commodified,
valued,
feared,
not seen.
but not seen.
Exhibited,
Lives have been pursued,
Have been hatred,
hatred,
by
ended by indifference, and betrayed by complacency,
by indifference,
and lost to the violence of the vigilante,
to the violence of the
sea of the
vigilante,
marketplace,
Lives of the
loss,
silence of the
free of the
comfortable,
marketplace,
sanity,
silence of
and
the
that black
the
comfortable,
lives are
marketplace,
sacred,
silence of the
inherently
comfortable.
valuable,
and
and
black lives
irreplaceable,
are sacred, inherently
as the body of the
valuable, and
human is to break
understand
irreplaceable.
the
that
heart
black
of the
lives
divine.
And that to oppress the body of the human is to break the heart of the
irreplaceable.
That the hearts of
divine.
our country is softened to the pain struggles for centuries.
The body of the human is to break the heart of the divine. For the day
Heal
when
the
the
shattered
Burn to
hearts,
when the bent
break the yoke of
hearts of our
oppression,
country are softened, the pain endured for
Of
centuries,
the
hearts of our
world,
country burn
the
the work
shattered
to
the
bind up the
pain
hearts
wounds, to
endured
heal
of
the
oppression.
shattered hands,
of oppression.
the
We
heart
will
to
do the
break the
work
yoke of oppression.
Amen.
wounds to heal the shattered heart, to break the yoke of oppression. As the beauty of the heavens
Of the heavens is revealed
To
to us
us
each
each
day,
day.
each day
Each day
revealed
you
to us
reveal to us the beauty
our
of
common
our common
humanity.
humanity. Amen.
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 Sheh Shalom bin Romav, Hu Ya'aseh Shalom Aleinu, Yal Kol Yisrael, Yal Kol Yoshvei Tevel, V'Yimru, Amen.
Amen.
All right?
Amen.
Amazing.
Take care, you all. Take care. And please, please, play your role.
Thank
Play
you.
your role. We need
Thank you.
to
Amen.
make change.
Thank you so much.
Amen.
Thank you.
Amen.
Toda rabah.
Balakavod.
Thank you, Rabbi.
How do I?
Good night, everybody. Alan, your time is done.
Thanks everybody for hanging with us. I'm going to end the call for everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Giselle.
Michelle.